Okay, hi everyone. So welcome to the first workshop in our training program between Euros and the Pan-African Debating Championships. Today we'll be talking about drugs, which is a very fun topic to start out this workshop series. And we're going to explain soon why it is actually quite relevant and an important thing to know about ahead of a few debates, other than being a fun topic to chat about. In terms of the structure of the workshop, so as you'll see in the tables of contents soon, we're going to talk a lot about which drugs are currently in circulation in the world and the specific cartels and supply channels that do them, as well as how they correspond with crime. What we won't be talking about as much, just in terms of caveats for the workshop, is we're not going to be talking in depth about law enforcement tactics and stuff like that against drugs, because as I'll explain soon, I think it is less applicable to many kinds of motions than the in-depth discussion I want to have about drugs themselves. This is topically. And then the second thing is that I would really encourage you to unmute and ask questions at the end of each slide, and not wait till the end, because we're not a very big group, and I think it makes more sense to iron stuff out when they come up as opposed to wait. Cool. So let's start with a little let's start with a little table of contents. So we're going to talk a bit about the types of drugs. Then we're going to spend a lot of time chatting about which are the biggest producers, as in where did the drugs get created, and then who are the biggest distributors and the way that they get into cartel networks. Finally, we're going to talk a bit about legal drugs, both in terms of their effect in and of themselves, but also in how they interact with illegal markets. And then we're going to talk about how cartels interact with those legal markets, and if we have time at the end, about policing tactics. Let's talk, first of all, about what drugs are currently circulating around the world. So this little picture, which is actually the reason I wanted to do this workshop, is actually a pretty common metric to look at how much harm drugs do, some of which you have probably seen. But I think that some parts of public conception aren't extremely aligned with the data that this table shows. So for example, can someone shout out some surprising things that you see about this table? I swear participants will get a secret reward that I will announce at some point in time. Please do speak up. Okay, so if no one has any ideas about what's surprising about this, I'm going to say some things that I found surprising. Yeah, anyone? I see James in the chat. Do you want to say something?
Oh, no, I didn't get the question, so I was just asking if you could repeat.
Yeah. So the question is just, what are some surprising things about the table you currently see on screen? So one thing that we just heard in the chat is that alcohol is ranked as the worst, which is indeed one very surprising part of this table. Alcohol being the fourth highest ranked drug in terms of harm to people outside of meth, crack, and heroin, greater than cocaine, greater than weed, and obviously all the other psychedelics at the bottom. And I guess there are some other things that could be somewhat surprising. For example, the fact that the gap between cocaine, tobacco is so small, and that the gap between amphetamines and cocaine, amphetamines being things that are sold much more commonly nowadays, also being quite low. All of this is just to say that there is a very strange relationship between what's legal and between what actually hurts either the user or hurts other people around them, in the sense that they are likely to commit accidents or violence or through residual harms like secondary smoking and stuff like that. And that's important because it kind of leads to my first point that I want to talk about, which is the hidden contents that can exist in debates about drugs. So the question of whether we shift from alcohol to another kind of drug, or whether if we prohibit alcohol, people move to other kinds of drugs to numb the day or obviously cross-apply this to any other part of the drug network, is it's really important to know how different drugs affect people, because it is often assumed as trivial that there is a very clear hierarchy in how bad they are, but they're very bad in different ways, and they're bad in ways that are not necessarily as clear-cut as you would imagine. So for example, there's a lot of evidence to show that in markets where cocaine is much more dominant than some other drugs that are much more affordable, for example, in certain markets when cocaine is more prevalent, even if weed is much less prevalent, sometimes there's less of a net harm to users because the affordability of the drug ends up mattering much more than how much it harms you per incident that you take it. So all of that's just to say, keep in mind that changes in drug networks can be extremely influential, and don't take it as a given that changing or decreasing the supply of one drug is always a net benefit in terms of what comes to replace it. And so the way that this maps on to sort of the helpfulness of this workshop is that drugs obviously affect questions of criminal justice and law, and it should be quite intuitive how you meld what we're going to talk about today into that sort of analysis. But I want to emphasize for a second how it could be useful in other kinds of motions, where many times drugs could be like the hidden extension, but is actually the thing that changes most in the debate that we don't usually consider because they change so much per region. So we don't have as many generic template ways of analyzing drugs as we do other things that might change more intuitively due to the policy. So for example, in IR motion, this is particularly pronounced. Things like the supply routes for drugs, or the chance that governments can do cross-border policymaking, or the chance that there's a market opening for a particular kind of drug or at a particular price, are all things that can change the drug market more than they change anything else. For example, all sorts of Mercosur provisions. Mercosur is a trade agreement being negotiated by the EU in South America, are very beneficial and will increase trade immensely. One part of it, and a harm that's often overlooked and indeed didn't come up in the semifinal that this was set at a few months ago, is the fact that a big harm to increasing the volume of trade between South America and Europe and making it much easier to transit between them is that the already extremely dysfunctional agencies at the border will be even less able to stop large volumes of drugs that are currently only limited by how much volume exists in trade and how much you could credibly pack into a single container ship and stuff like that. So this is one example. Another example is migration within countries. So things like the employment opportunities that you have in cities, or the fact that you would, what sort of skills you would have to get, or what happens when cartels have to move because all people in their village or in their town had to move to cities, and what they do in cities instead. All of these sorts of questions can really affect crime immensely when you change them, even if it is in service of another target, like, for example, urbanization or economic industrial policies, for example, increasing a specific sector over another, especially when they happen in rural areas in countries that have a lot of crime. This is always an important metric to keep in mind and sort of check how it could change given the policy's effects on drugs. And the last field that I wanted to mention is healthcare. And here, I think that the questions that are important are sort of twofold. The first is how much and how likely it is that medical behavior and the behavior of particular practitioners is good or bad. So a prime example of this is the Euros motion about whether we should trust doctors or not. And we'll talk about that a bit later, but clearly one important example there would be the chance for overprescription for doctors with a greater or lower degree of trust. So that's sort of the micro level in healthcare. And then the macro level in healthcare that's also very important is what trends are being set in terms of which drugs are being sold openly and which drugs are being developed. And this is important because the illegal market is, in a sense, a mirror of the legal market for drugs, which is things that are unavailable in the legal market and substitutes to things that are unavailable often will be prioritized by cartels and by black markets, even if the change in the legal market isn't big. Sort of think of it like a financial investment. Cartels are competing against each other. So the best thing to do always is to look at trends in legal markets and try to overcorrect before the trends completely take shape. So an example of this that we'll talk about is that when the opioid epidemic hit in the US, what cartels did is that very quickly after the publication of a lot of class actions being taken against Purdue Pharma that produced Oxy, which is the main opioid in the at the time in the opioid pandemic in the US. What many cartels did is that they started to rapidly amp up their production of opioids from other products that they were producing, knowing that there was now a group of people who could no longer get access to their Oxy and would then probably go to the black market to get it. Or they would do things like expand into stimulants in areas where they weren't already serving a lot of when they were thinking of expanding into richer markets, many of them shifted into stimulants like meth, etc., in order to counteract the demand for opioids and give a drug that is somewhat easier to smuggle. So for all of these reasons, it's really important to pay attention to whether there is a context that is in which drugs are very relevant. And then you will find that in many, many motion types, even if they don't directly tie to drugs, there's an argument or content that can be made about drugs, and certainly impacting that can be made about drugs. It only depends on where the motion is set and not as much about the motion type. Cool. If there aren't any question about this broad sort of pitch for why you should listen to the workshop, we can move on to more substantive things. Are there any questions?
Just one thing. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Are we allowed to answer by just unmuting ourselves and speaking, or should we react in the chat?
When I call out for people for answers, you're allowed to unmute and answer. That would be really helpful. Cool. Let's talk about the kinds of drugs that exist. So this is a very simplistic breakdown, and there are many ways of classifying the kinds of drugs that exist. But for the purposes of our discussion, I want to divide them, I guess, into two main lumps. The first main lump that you see on screen right now is a lump of effects. So drugs mostly fall into three categories in terms of effects, and some can do some of both, some of two of them, but mostly their primary functions are one of these three. One is a stimulant, that is to say it activates the central nervous system. It often does this by releasing a lot of dopamine. It can also release norepinephrine. These just make you feel extremely rewarded in the moment quickly, and they often make you feel much more alert, much more focused, thanks to the norepinephrine, and they make you much more likely to, they make you feel much more capable and achieving. So these sort of stimulants include things like cocaine, as well as many on-brand Adderall, ADHD medications like Adderall, Ritalin, Vyvanse, etc. They also can include certain antidepressant medications, but those are less commonly traded illicitly. And maybe the most common example of a stimulant that is completely legal and we use routinely is coffee, that gives us also works on similar networks to those other stimulants that I listed, but obviously at a much lower intensity. The other class, the second class to talk about in terms of effects is hallucinogens. So hallucinogens distort perception in an extremely all-encompassing way. So the way you think, what you perceive, real or unreal voices, all of this changes with these sorts of drugs. And they work quite differently from stimulants. Some would say that they work even like that they're completely different from both depressants and stimulants, in the sense that they don't necessarily work on releasing as many hormones or at increasing a lot of, they don't necessarily work at increasing dopamine levels. They mostly work at increasing serotonin levels or changing them in order to alter your perception. So while certain hallucinogens might make you feel very good, usually their main effect is sort of trip, where you see many illusions, perceive the world as distorted. Maybe you have some positive emotions that come from the drug directly, but usually the reason that people like the drug directly is because of the hallucinations it provides, rather than the direct emotional experience that's created chemically, unlike the two other unlike the two other substances, the classes of substances. And the last class of substance to talk about are depressants. And what these do is that they reduce brain activity in one way or another. So the most common kind of depressant we're going to talk about, and the most severe, is opioids, which decrease a lot of pain or make you feel numbed in certain ways, while also mixing certain stimulation capabilities in certain cases. But these opioids generally reduce your brain activity when it comes to pain. There are also other drugs that reduce brain activity in a more more broadly. For example, that's what alcohol does. That's to some extent what ketamine does as well. Are there any questions about these different classes of drug effects? Cool. Now let's talk about what is arguably the biggest trend in terms of drug consumption. So in recent years, we moved from the classical plant-based drugs, which include heroin that's made from poppy seeds, from plant-based, not poppy seeds, from the thing that comes out of poppy plants at their bottom. I forget what the name for it is in English. But these are this is how heroin and morphine are made, and what opioids look like for many decades until the 2000s, around the 2000s, certainly the 2010s. Second, we have coca, which is the plant that's used to make cocaine, which is the main stimulant that was traded illegally during this time. There are other sorts of stimulants that are also made from similar plants. For example, I think it's called ephedrine, that's made from other variants, but is a much weaker stimulant. And lastly, obviously, weed, cannabis, marijuana. These are all made from marijuana and have been grown internationally for centuries. The thing that has happened in recent decades is that both legally and illegally, we have found many more commercially viable ways of producing drugs without a plant-based component at the beginning of this production chain. So with opioids, it means the transition from heroin that is opium-based to fentanyl that is completely synthesized and made completely chemically. It's still an opioid, but it is synthesized chemically with the initial materials that you use not being opium, but rather chemical precursors. And it's also taken the shape of methamphetamine that's also synthesized. It's much harder to synthesize than fentanyl, but methamphetamine is a form of stimulant that is similar to cocaine in terms of its effect, usually stronger and more potent. But its main difference is that it lasts 20 to 30 times longer, with cocaine only lasting 20 to 30 minutes at its peak. Meth lasts for many, many hours. Fentanyl similarly is 100 times cheaper to produce than heroin, and it is much more potent, 50 times more potent, etc. All of these things, this shifts are very bad. And this is because of two reasons. One that we'll talk about later is that they have made the process of drug trafficking much easier for multiple reasons. But the second thing is that even just per user, these synthetic drugs are much more harmful than their plant-based predecessors, both because they're much more addictive due to higher potency. So it's even harder to get off fentanyl than it is heroin, but also because the chance of overdosing on these drugs is much higher than the chance of overdosing before. For example, there's a common misconception that heroin causes many people to overdose on the drug the first time they inject it. That could be true, that does happen, but it's actually quite rare to OD on heroin alone, very rare. It usually only happens when you mix it with other compounds and drugs like sleeping pills and alcohol. And even then, OD rates are quite low. The harm that heroin and cocaine take in and of themselves ends up usually happening in the medium to long term, not in the short term. This is not the case with fentanyl, with meth to some extent, and definitely not with fentanyl, that is so potent that the sort of range that you could take without overdosing becomes much smaller than heroin. So uncontrolled doses are much more likely to cause an overdose in and of themselves, even in new time users, and even in users that don't know they're taking these synthetic drugs. So this is sort of the top level framing for what the major problem is in the shift of current markets. And I would also note that just in terms of your ability to place the importance of arguments about drugs in a debate, since it's something that we're not that used to hearing about when it sounds out of place, it is quite easy to like emotionally like present it to a judge as something that they are just biased to not notice, and not something that is actually less harmful than many other questions that we ask in debate. Like, most people don't completely internalize the fact that fentanyl is now the leading cause of death in over 15 countries for people who are between 18 and 43-year-olds. And this is not just in the US, where 38,000 people died due to fentanyl overdoses, I think in 2023. It's also in countries with a much smaller population that have a similar number of casualties. So for example, Iran and Russia are currently dealing with amounts of fentanyl overdoses annually that are slightly larger than the US, even though Russia has a third and Iran has about an eighth of the population that the US have. So these are very big problems. They're very big problems outside of the developed world as well. And it is very plausible that even macro level policies mostly can change the most when it comes to drugs as opposed to other avenues. Okay. Let's try to explain for a second what happened and why this shift is occurring, and some more nuances that we can use in debates. And I want to do this by first talking about the producers of plant-based drugs originally, and what these regions look like and how they're evolving. So as I said before, there are mostly three plants we want to talk about. Opium, which is used for heroin, morphine, oxy, coca, which is used for cocaine and crack, and cannabis, which is used for marijuana. These are the three sorts of plants that are the most important for international production in plant-based drugs. Now, I want to talk about a few areas of the world that are leading each of those plant production areas. So Afghanistan is the world's leader in opium. Well, not anymore, but it was for a long, long time, for at least 20 years between 2001 and 2021, likely before that as well. And the reason for Afghanistan's centrality in the global production chain of heroin is that it was the ideal growing environment, not from a plant perspective. Opium is quite, relative to other plants that we'll talk about, easy to grow. And so it's not that Afghanistan has a particularly tailored climate. It's quite favorable, but it's not uniquely important. The thing that happened in Afghanistan that made it much easier to grow opium relative to other regions is that the Mujahideen's control taking of control over large parts of Afghanistan starting from 1979, which, to people who don't know, the Mujahideen was the civil resistance group fighting against the Soviet Union and later the US. Later they formed into the Taliban when they fought the US, but this was the insurgency group present in Afghanistan for decades, from the 70s until the early 2000s, when the US invaded, and when they obviously got moved back into exclusively into the countryside. But it's been present there for a very long time over its many iterations, in place of the government that could not reach all sorts of countryside and farmland areas because of how stretched thin it was in terms of resources fighting the Mujahideen in other population centers. And this sort of economic situation for such a long time meant that industries in areas that were under the control of the Mujahideen had time to sort of readjust away from traditional farming and other products that they made before the rise of before the Civil War. During, for example, the early 20th century, they shifted much more towards opium production and opium farms, which were obviously not regulated under the Civil War, and actually were used by the Mujahideen and the Taliban for a lot of arms purchases, which gave those farms a lot of revenue to expand, etc. So this was this meant that for a long time, the Mujahideen and the Taliban ran what was called as an opium economy, where the way that they were sustaining themselves as non-state actors that were not recognized by virtually any state was through the selling of illicit goods, and specifically heroin. But this economic dependency on opium ended, or at least was mitigated, when the Taliban took control over Afghanistan and when the US left in 2021, which really reshifted the way that the Taliban approaches the economic calculus around production of heroin. So nowadays, the Taliban announced banning opium because of the extremely large shares of the population, both in Afghanistan and, as I mentioned, in Iran and in Pakistan, that are currently addicted to drugs and to opium, and the immense pressure that they got from neighboring countries to do this, and the wish to sort of reinstate relationships with some of those countries. So this has been a path to some partial normalization for the Taliban, also with some European countries that that wanted this initially. And normalization, obviously, with Iran and Pakistan was also contingent on this epidemic in their borders. So it's sort of seen as a conditionality situation between Afghanistan and some other countries. But the actual efficacy of this ban is unclear yet for two reasons. First, obviously, we don't have data on how much the Taliban is implementing this. We do know that they themselves probably aren't profiting from opium directly, at least not centrally. But we don't know if it is true that small farmland farmers have stopped producing this under Taliban supervision. The Taliban struggles not to the same extent, but with many of the problems that the Afghani central government faced in enforcing this and overseeing opium production. But nevertheless, the rates have dropped to some extent, just more gradually than we would have hoped. The second reason that it's not clear whether Afghanistan's drug production will stop is that increasingly farmers are turning away from opium, but they're turning to meth, and which is the synthesized stimulant that I mentioned before. And what's important to know is that meth has two ways of synthesization. One is completely chemical, and we'll talk about who does it later. And the other is using a plant-based original substance, which is a Federa plant that is often used in some medications. And so often what would be done in this form of production for meth is that you would melt down or you would extract a very large amount of powder that's used for from these plants that's used for other drugs. And then you would do all sorts of chemical processes to refine it and make it extremely concentrated until it could be made into meth. The reason this distinction is very important is because in addition to being important in the fentanyl global trade, Afghanistan might become important in the meth global trade and the stimulant global trade internationally, because this kind of meth is less damaging than the completely chemical form of meth, which means that many countries might prefer to have this imported into their territories as opposed to preferring the worst kinds of meths that typically come from Mexican cartels. So Afghanistan could possibly use the meth production as a way to increase its drug production, and is to some extent doing it now without having as much backlash for it, and potentially also being able to extract some leverages on this being a better form relative to other forms of meth. By the way, the same is true for fentanyl. A big diplomatic challenge, which is one of the examples, I think, of the many things that you would never consider in an international relations round if you didn't know about drugs, is that the EU is actually, despite its initial openness to Afghanistan banning heroin, is actually now extremely opposed to it. And the reason for this is because, well, at least many policymakers in the EU are. Politicians are a different story. But the reason for this is that fentanyl is so much worse than heroin that it's likely that by cutting the supply chain of heroin into Europe, exactly what happens in the US will happen again, which is that opioid consumers will start buying fentanyl, which will drive up the amount of fentanyl that gets sent to Europe and not just to the US, that is currently the main location for it. So this is a very big fear for European policymakers, and it's a very big IR threat to consider when it comes to motions about the way that EU handles its relations with South America and with Central Asia and with Southeast Asia, as we'll talk about now. So the next region is that also is very involved in opioid production is the Golden Triangle. And this region is, as you can see on the map, a region that concentrates mostly Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, but there are some, in the past, there were some opium farming regions also in Thailand and in China. In China, that is much more regulated now domestically. Thailand has actually used its past Golden Triangle opioid fields for tourism. So they have essentially completely eliminated their opioid farms and now using them for a hotel and museums and stuff like that about opioid farming. Vietnam and Laos each still have some opioid production, but it has relatively decreased rather than increased in recent years. And the big player to talk about here that still produces not only the most opioids in the Golden Triangle, but ever since the Taliban's ban has also become the main international producer of heroin, is Myanmar. And just to give you a brief background, Myanmar, you probably remember, in 2021 had experienced a coup where the president called Aung San Suu Kyi, I think, or Chi, sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, got ousted and the military took over. But the president didn't fold that easily. She retreated with her shadow government and with a military wing to the north, to more rural areas. And ever since, there's been a very brutal civil war fought between many different factions with differing degrees of loyalty to the shadow government versus the junta. Now, the reason this is important is because, very similar to Afghanistan, this has meant that the different factions fighting each other have gotten into sorts of an arms race. And in a sense, this is even worse than what happened in Afghanistan, because in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union and the US were never the ones producing and exporting heroin. It was more one-sided. Here, because all of the different factions have access to different opioid fields across the country, and because each of them is vying for more arms because they're in an arms race, the way that they have handled it is by cooperating and contracting local criminal organizations to produce en masse as much opium as they can to enrich themselves quicker and try to launch a sort of full force offensive to take out the other side. And this leads to an incentive structure that continues to to drive down both sides into producing more and more opioids. And the thing about Myanmar is that its opioid producers are not just opioid producers, unlike other countries. The opioid producers themselves do a lot of other things in order to profiteer and give more money to the factions that are funding them. So Myanmar has a very big scamming industry, both phone calls, but also kidnapping and ransoms that are all run by these same producers. And more scam centers open with more and more drug production and revenues globally. And they also do a lot of illegal mining. So things like jade and gold that are extracted illegally for the exact same reason by the exact same people. Are there any questions either about Afghanistan or the Golden Triangle before we move on? Cool. So the last thing I'll say is that what you might notice amongst these two typical opioid producers is two things. First, they are not in Latin America. They're completely disconnected. Well, in the sense of where the production happens. They're completely disconnected from the way we typically perceive the usual drug routes in this world. And that is a shame because, as we mentioned before, opioids are extremely harmful. Many countries have not dealt with their opioids, with their widespread opioid use yet, especially developing countries. And so the presence of opioids in Asia is a sort of drug crisis that we don't really talk about enough, and that is very separate from the struggle with other sorts of drugs that are using the Latin American lines. So that's one good thing to keep in mind. But the second issue, and the reason it's important, is because you see how drug producers that get a lot of money and are not stopped, especially in the context of these wars, often can use this money in the long run to upscale from whatever they were mining locally into more complex synthetic drugs. So this looks like Afghanistan being able, Afghani producers being able to refine meth, which they couldn't do before. And it looks like people in the Golden Triangles running all these scams and starting synthetic production of drugs, not just opioids, with the money they've gained. And this is also helpful to understand why it is really important that small criminal gangs never start to be large-scale drug producers, because once you have become a large-scale drug producer, it's very easy to move across the drug production field into other areas that make you more insulated from government intervention. The last producer to talk about is the Andes Mountains, the range of mountains in Latin America. If you guys want, there's a picture at the end, but it is essentially a range of mountains that goes from the very southern tip of the continent in Chile all the way up the western coast, and then sort of hugs the top of South America around Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador, and etc. And here is where we get to a region that produces because of genuine ecological specialty. So the Andes have been I think around 98% of global production of cocaine happens in the Andes, because cocaine is, as we mentioned before, a drug that comes from coca. And coca is a plant that can only survive in very tropical climates, but also benefits from very high altitudes. And so this makes the Andes, in terms of its consistency along a certain plane and the fact that it meets both of these climate and altitude conditions, the ideal place for the production of cocaine, which is why it amped up there. Now, the three main producers of cocaine in terms of countries have been Peru, Colombia, and what is the third? Bolivia. But in recent years, concentration of the production itself has been largely in Colombia. And it's been true for a while, but this concentration is growing relative to other countries like Bolivia and Peru. And the reason that the concentration of cocaine became so entrenched in Colombia is because, once again, a civil war made it so a faction picked it as a very primary form of revenue. So in Colombia's case, they were fighting one of the longest civil wars in the world from 1964 to 2016 against a militia called FARC. It was a communist militia founded by farmers in during the time that Colombia was ruled by a very unequal puppet government to the US. And ever since, FARC capitalized on cocaine production and created a pact with the Sinaloa cartel that we'll talk about that made it much easier to have very large-scale exports of cocaine from Colombia to Mexico that would then be trafficked around the world. But in 2016, FARC voluntarily dismantled after a ceasefire agreement that they signed with Colombia's central government in Havana. And this has created many shifts in the global market for drugs, especially for stimulants. Because when FARC collapsed, many European gangs and other smaller local criminal gangs that succeeded FARC, given that Colombia still cannot completely enforce in its rural areas in the north, have inherited what FARC was doing and what FARC consolidated, which is the production of cocaine there. And many of the cartels that wanted to be the distributors initially were now also willing to come into the production end because they knew that FARC dismantled, which meant that trustworthy production was harder to get. And this is important because it has made Colombia a sort of turf war state where different cartels and organizations have plunged their, have sunk their teeth and nails into certain gangs in the area that essentially operate as their local contractors. They get completely financially supported by whatever international organization, and those local cartels then go and farm coca or extort coca out of farmers that farm it. But since it's so decentralized, there is a lot of turf wars and direct violence in Colombia that spills over to some other countries that have some untapped coca farms. For example, areas like Ecuador that didn't produce so far but saw some of the highest rates of gang violence in recent years are all because of these turf wars between warring factions for control over production of coca. Now, the last thing that I want to mention is that FARC's collapse also changed a lot of the way that political and law enforcement agencies have dealt with cocaine production. So first of all, one very important policy that was pursued by the US and by Latin American allies of the US is something called fumigation, whatever. I don't know how to pronounce this word. You see it at the bottom. But essentially, it involves spraying with aerial force a lot of these fields with things that made their output much, much lower. So the amount of cocaine you get per coca is much lower. And this was done during FARC's control over the fields, and it created a very high price for cocaine because of how little was extorted, and it in many ways forced FARC into a state of much less revenue consistently. And this has meant that throughout the raids, cocaine production internationally was much lower than it could have been with the amount of coca that was being farmed. But that stopped ever since FARC collapsed, because now these areas are considered part of Colombia's central government, even if they're a central government's authority, even if there are like small infighting between different gangs, which meant that the amount that you get per coca plant of cocaine has risen sharply. And this oversupply sort of breeds overproduction, because you want to sell more of your remaining cocaine. So you start pricing it cheaply relative to other drugs, which means people go back to cocaine, etc. So these are some shifts that have happened in the cocaine market from the Andes. Are there any questions about any part of this section? No questions at all? Okay, so in that case, let's move on to the second part, which is talking about distributors and cartels. Now that we have covered sort of where the main areas of plant-based drugs, of traditional drugs come from, and of some synthetic drugs, let's talk about the cartels who manage, distribute them, and to some extent replace them with synthetic drugs. So the main region, unsurprisingly, that we're going to chat about in this section is Mexico. And here's what you need to know about the historical context of Mexico becoming the world's drug capital. In the 80s, a guy that you all may have heard of, called Pablo Escobar, was the most notorious drug trafficker in the world. And he was Colombian. He was head of a Colombian cartel that was very dominant during the later decades of the 20th century. But what happened is that the US throughout the 80s started implementing a lot of very strict enforcement and attempts to intercept drug trade that were going through Colombia. And that's because the Colombian cartels, the way that they had access to the US was through shipping routes to Cuba that would then get shipped off to Florida. And this was quite easy to control because there were much less ports, and because the US Navy had much more of a expertise and scale in sea than the cartels did. In addition to many of the measures we mentioned before, like spraying the fields in Colombia and stuff like that. This has meant that like in the 80s, US policymakers thought that this would just decrease the amount of supply in the drug trades, and then demand would naturally fall, and that's it. But what happened next is sort of the main critique that people have towards US drug policy, internationally speaking, which is called the balloon effect. What happened after this Colombian channel got eliminated or far less competitive is that demand didn't stop, and rather smaller Mexican cartels started being able to provide a route for those drugs that didn't go through Cuba. And this route was an on-land route that passed through many Central American countries from the Andes until it got to Mexico, where the Mexican cartels would then handle trafficking it into the US through the southern border, which is much harder to control. It has there's much less intelligence asymmetry in terms of the US's capacity to watch trade that happens on Earth, like on land. There's obviously many more areas that you could go through in terms of what's traversable, and there are many more points of entry relative to ports. So this has created a much more hostile environment for drug trafficking. And it also meant that Mexican cartels, being the ones that centered the trafficking routes, have started to dominate at the expense of Colombian cartels that have essentially now become puppets for production for those Mexican cartels. And the two powerful cartels currently, as you can see on the map, are Sinaloa and Jalisco, which is called it's CJNG, I think, whatever. Yes, it's Cartel Jalisco New Generation. So it's CJNG. And these two cartels have been fighting for the trafficking route through Mexico and are by far the world's biggest drug traffickers into all areas of the world, almost, apart from some local Asian traffickers. But they have some very important differences that can really influence the way that you debate drug debates, and in the sense of which of these two actors gets more or less powerful relative to the other in responding to certain policies or certain changes. So Sinaloa is the more famous, the more historical, and the more long-lasting cartel in Mexico. It was founded by 3 members of the Guadalajara cartel, which preceded it. The one you may have heard of is El Chapo, and the 2 other ones were called El Mayo and El Azul. And what they did is, in response to quite effective US targeting tactics for drug lords, so the US was quite effective at capturing drug lords that led and were the central bosses for particular cartels, which demolished them in Mexico, which was an ongoing trend throughout the 90s and the 2000s. What Sinaloa did is very intentionally decided to decentralize completely. So not only did they have 3 central bosses, which were El Chapo, El Mayo, and El Azul, the Sinaloa is a federation rather than being a family clan. So these 3 leaders represent 3 families, and very quickly, even though they were the prominent figures, this expanded to more and more families. So the way that Sinaloa is run today is that essentially it is a federation of family bosses or family leaders that decide independently things on their own, and then have some centralized body or meeting space in which they decide things together. And this is a very big difference from the completely top-down structure that was previously dominated in Mexico and also in Europe in terms of the way that mafia and organized crime were built up. So the way Sinaloa expanded is that they got strongholds in northwest Mexico. They also have some of their own poppy and marijuana production, not even close to the scales of Asia, but they are closer to the US, so they have a slight market there. And mostly they use these marijuana and poppy things as the booster to start doing their main trade, which is the drug trafficking of cocaine. And what's important to know is that the main profit you can get is by trafficking cocaine, not by producing it. In Lima, you can get cocaine for roughly 100 markup, which means it costs 2 times what it costs to produce. In the EU, you could get it for 1,500 markup, which essentially means it costs 15 what it took to produce. And this is not factoring in the revenue you would make from trafficking it internally in Peru, for example. So this is why it's easy for them to make much more money and to very quickly eclipse producers that may be trafficking their drugs on their own in these Southern American countries. And then what they would do is that they would enter a lot of these countries like Colombia and like Ecuador. They would threaten local producers, maybe kill a few of them. And then when the local producers saw that they were handling a criminal organization with much more money, they would fold and they would accept being absorbed into the Sinaloa network. So this is how Sinaloa runs operations. Now, what the major shift that happened in Mexico that you should know about is that in 2014 and 2016, the U.S. El Chapo was extradited to the U.S., but the U.S. managed to have in custody two of the gang's leaders, and in 2024 they also arrested the third, called El Mayo, and this has caused a civil war within Sinaloa between the different family factions that have now federalized. So the sons of El Chapo that are called Los Chapitos, and the son of El Mayo, which is called still El Mayo, or Mayo Flaco or something like that, represents their families now, and are fighting between each other for control over roots in the aftermath of their parents' death. And this sort of civil war has also bred the rise of another cartel in Mexico that is much more recent than the Sinaloa, and that is Jalisco. And Jalisco also rose out of a succession battle, kind of similar to what Sinaloa is going through right now. It determined and became the dominant faction in South Mexico through murdering all of its opponents, essentially. And these two cartels, Sinaloa and Jalisco, are competing for roots in Mexico. And occasionally they do run into some violent skirmishes with each other, especially in ports and on the US border. But so far, they haven't had a full-fledged war between them, maybe between certain proxies, but they don't fight as directly if it's not for a central port of entry. But as we'll talk about soon, that is about to change. Now, before we talk about the consequences of the tensions between these cartels, it is very important to know the differences between them, because we'll talk in a second about which of those cartels is favored by what. But something that I think is very effective is trying to isolate certain characteristics about these cartels and understand in certain motions that if one of those characteristics becomes more profitable or more helpful in the international drug market due to whatever policy. For example, it could be making distribution networks with international partners more important than smuggling, or whatever it may be. But a change to this characteristic, you can very easily use as a case to explain a change to one other characteristic that these cartels deviate from each other from. So, for example, the main impact that you probably be going for in any case that has to do with these cartels is how aggressive Jalisco is. Sinaloa doesn't kill people for fun anymore in the way that they used to before. It's true that they expanded into many markets by killing and intimidating, but what they're doing now is different. For example, they've recently expanded to Guatemala, and with the amount of money and connections that they have, they don't need to kill people. It just creates resentment towards them. So instead, what they do is that they have a lot of corrupt shops, money laundering schemes. They launder them into Guatemala, and then they just buy it from farmers there in order to get their trafficking route, because the price is so low anyway. What happens with Jalisco is very different. Jalisco kills many of the local producers in order to send a message, kind of similar to what Sinaloa would do initially, but they do it with even more brutality, which they inherited from their succession fight. So, for example, they sent videos of them cannibalizing certain gang members, killing civilians and children more openly to send a message. So they're much more extortionist in the way that they try to form local alliances with smaller gangs than Sinaloa. In terms of trade routes, Sinaloa is much more international than Jalisco, in the sense that Sinaloa partners with organized crime in Europe and in China, and Jalisco has to rely much more on its own distribution network. So it does this by trafficking with many, many trucks into the US, and then from the US going on to Canada, and from there trafficking to other destinations. But they don't have the direct route as much that Sinaloa has, which just sends a lot of drugs into European markets through shipments because of their relationship with organized crime there. Finally, in terms of main drugs and management, so another very important thing to know about Jalisco is that the way that they have become central in Mexico and the way that they sort of unseated the Sinaloa monopoly that existed for many years is that they have gone full into synthetics. So they are producing meth, among the biggest meth producers in the world. They produce fentanyl. They do a little bit of cocaine and marijuana, but much less than Sinaloa. And this created a situation where Jalisco was for a second there, around right before the 2020, the bigger cartel in terms of revenue that they were bringing in than Sinaloa. And this pushed Sinaloa to also start making fentanyl, especially around North Mexico, and pushing it into the US. And this is what has been driving the fentanyl epidemic in the US, this sort of tit for tat on who can produce more synthetics between these two cartels. But it's important because Sinaloa's competitive advantage is in plant-based drugs. They're producing synthetics somewhat. They even eclipsed Jalisco in terms of the amount of fentanyl that they're producing. But they are a drug network that will have a much easier time going back to plant-based drugs than Jalisco, which is why some people say that Jalisco should be eliminated or weakened enough in order to allow Sinaloa to recapture its monopoly on the market, because that means Sinaloa might start leaning back into plant-based drugs. And that's something to consider in terms of which drug policies we want to see around Latin America. Finally, in terms of management, we already talked about Sinaloa's federated and family-based management. Jalisco is much more centralized. They have one leader, one big boss, and then they have many regional franchises. But those franchises still have to answer to the boss. They're not autonomous. And those franchises are called plazas. Are there any questions?
I do have one, but I don't know if it relates well to what you're speaking about right now.
Sure, go ahead anyway.
I'm not sure if it was misinformation, but I heard that China was using fentanyl as a way of weakening the US. Is that something that's true? And is that something that countries can do?
Yeah, great question. And we're going to talk about it very soon. So yeah, I'll get to it and then feel free to ask me if it still doesn't answer your question. So in terms of what synthetics have done to this race between the Mexican cartels, we already went through most of this, but first and importantly, they made the drug network, and this is important not just in synthetics generally, right? From a monopoly to a duopoly between Jalisco and Sinaloa. And the other very important feature to know about synthetics is that the way they are stored and produced really changes the way that cartels set up outposts or labs or stations, et cetera, around the countries that they're present in. And this is because synthesization is not land intensive in the way that farming is. You don't need to have many, many plantations. You don't need to grow the crops in certain conditions for a long time before they mature and you're able to extract from them, etc. Instead, what you do need for synthetics is a lot of component trading. So what that means is that you need chemical precursors that come from foreign nations, most prominently China, exactly. And so it's become much more important to control ports or to control certain labs or to control and have connections with certain even universities in Mexico and Lebanon's case, or at the very least be in urban areas with more with people who have more expertise, because you also want to get your own domestic producers and domestic experts that can cook up whatever drugs they do in the labs that you give them. So land has decreased in value for drug cartels. Urban centers and ports and infrastructure chokeholds for trafficking and for trafficking drugs have become much more important, and so have expertise. The other thing is that in countries that aren't Mexico, so in countries that are more consumers of drugs as opposed to producers or traffickers of drugs, so this is most prominently in Europe, there have been what's called cartelitos, or like amateur labs, like the Breaking Bad picture that you have. So these are kind of small labs or small chemists that just cook up themselves and then sell it to people, either freelance or sell it to a dealer who then sell to a trafficker who then gives it to their dealer, have started arising much more. And there's an important nuance here. Like the market is a duopoly now and not a monopoly, but that doesn't mean that these amateur labs are competing with the big cartels, because the difference is that if I have a big farm of weed, it's much easier for me to start trafficking large amounts of weed. But since you don't need a very big amount of fentanyl in order to get it through the border, you can smuggle a very small amount, which is what makes them harder to detect. The reason that's important is because it means that even amateur creators of very small contents can still make money off of drugs, but this amount of drugs is not worth it or feasible to start trafficking alone without a cooperating partner, which is why a lot of these amateur labs actually need the cartels to traffic for them much more than weed farms used to need in the past. Now, the last thing I want to tell you about cartels that is kind of shocking is another under-discussed problem. We keep talking about the things that get into the US through the cartels, and not as much the things that the cartels take out of the US into Mexico. And this is arms. The Mexican cartels have militarized to become some, if not the strongest paramilitary organizations in the world. In fact, I think after Hezbollah's decline, there has been data that they are by far the strongest paramilitary organizations in the world. And the way that they do this is twofold. First, they often trade with American arms manufacturers directly through all sorts of like money laundering schemes, like setting up very clearly fake shops in Mexico that the arms manufacturers would sell arms to, and then wash their hands of the paper trail, and then this offshore like this shop in Mexico is essentially cartel run and would give them the weapons. Or what they would do in the past when they had less established connections is that they would just have their traffickers traffic weapons across the border that they bought at US gun shops. And over time, this supply has become immense. But they don't only have massive amounts of guns that come from the US. They've also evolved to use extremely advanced military technologies that are very, very threatening. So cartels have been using IEDs, which are explosives. They've been using drones much more, and they have been using submarines much more. You might ask yourself, how did they get submarines? Well, with the amount of money they're making from synthetics, they have been able to launch raids against militaries. For example, they seized a submarine from the Colombian military in 2020. And FARC was constructing it for them for many years and before their collapse. And all of these things have meant that directly engaging cartels in the ways that we usually debate in rounds, or like going to war on cartels, is not feasible. It would be like going to war with another nation in terms of their military capacities. Not only that, but cartels are increasingly using the mercenary market. So they're hiring many mercenaries from Colombia, from the small gangs that I talked about that have gained experience fighting in other proxies. But they've also hired a lot of mercenaries and sent their own troops into Ukraine in order to get more tactical and combat experience. And they're using a lot of the drone expertise that's being gained in the Ukraine conflict, which is why a lot of drug trafficking now goes through drones that are even harder for the US to detect. And this probably means we're looking at increased volumes of drug trafficking through drones in the next few years. Okay. I want to talk about Europe, then we'll maybe take a 5-minute break and we'll wrap up with some motion examples and with short stuff on legal drugs. But I want to talk, sorry?
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, before you move on, I want to ask, so I don't know if this is an abstract question, but you can tell me. When you said that like when you talk about this idea that like debate is running cases that talk about states having war on cartels. Is this something that arises from like what the motions are asking debaters to debate, or is this like a norm in how debaters conceptualize drug debates, especially when it pertains to how the state should act on cartels when it comes to them?
So, yeah, so that's a great question. I think we'll look at it more when we look at more direct motions that relate to drugs, and we'll talk about that. But my general answer to this question is that I do think that there is a tendency to set law enforcement motions that are very broad about the scale of operations they use. So, for example, one of the motions we're going to look at is Panama's Mano Dura motion that just includes using greater capacities, military capacities, like a more hawkish police against drugs. Now, the issue here is that while obviously it often is necessary to set very broad policies, because it's hard to have a deep debate about a narrow set of policies sometimes, it is very useful for debaters to know which of those policies is most realistic, or which of those policies creates the least harm and is most likely to maneuver beyond these realities. Because I think, for example, many debaters would make the assumption that from such a broad policy basket, the most obvious case to run is just, we'll kill the cartels. Like, let's just militarize against them. Let's just eliminate them. And this misunderstands the reality of how strong they are and the capacity that you have to take them out. Or the weapons that they have and the ways in which they could cause mass destruction in civil society. So the answer to your question, I think, is that this is more of a debater's issue, even if the motions are a little misleading. Okay, let's talk about Europe. So Europe has three important kind of centers for drugs. The first and most important center is the Italian mafia, which you might have heard about in the past. Specifically, there are two Italian mafias that are relevant here. Well, one is relevant, but another helps explain it. So the most powerful criminal organization in Italy by far today is, I think it's 'Ndrangheta, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, which is a gang that is based in Calabria, part of the Boot in South Italy, and they have become extremely rich and dominate in Italy through the drug trade and through their involvement in the Coke network. And what happened is that, as I mentioned before, 'Ndrangheta and Sinaloa made a pact sometime around the 2000s, we don't exactly know when, where, but we're also friendly, the 'Ndrangheta was also friendly with other cartels before Sinaloa. And this pact essentially formalized and structured the path that drugs are going to take for the next 2 decades, which is they're going to originate from ports in Mexico or from ports of proxies of Sinaloa in Colombia. These shipments would then go onto a port in Italy that is called Taro, I think it's a port in Calabria. And from there would be shipped to the rest of Europe with, of course, hefty intermediary fees that 'Ndrangheta would get on either trafficking them or distributing them in the countries that 'Ndrangheta would then ship the drugs off to. And this has also meant that 'Ndrangheta is able to establish not a monopoly, but a much stronger singular presence in Italy than has been seen in a long time, especially relative to what was the strongest gang in the past, which is Casa Nostra, which is a Sicilian gang. But the reason that 'Ndrangheta was able to outcompete Casa Nostra significantly in recent years was the fact that Casa Nostra was far more nascent in the drug trafficking and drug trade situation, and didn't capitalize on the revenues as much. The reason that this is important is because it has also created a shift in Italy and in the rest of Europe, similar to what we see in Latin America, which is that since trafficking has become so important for organized crime as a revenue-making source, organized crime is now more based in ports, in corruption, in urban centers than it is in inland and at getting protection fees from shops or shooting up other cartels that scared them. Like all of these extraction and territorial revenue streams generate much less cash than drugs, which is why cartels in areas that have this the capacity to trade in drugs are shifting away from these arrangements. The next thing to talk about is the Balkan drug trade. So Balkan drug trades are not at any end of the production network. They're not the traffickers themselves. They are sometimes the distributors, but they don't monopolize that part of the industry. And they definitely don't control production. But what happened to Balkan organized crime is that after the Balkan Wars, there were many arms chasing few people, as in Serbia still has one of the highest rates of firearms per individual in the world, but after the war ended, there was no clear use for these weapons. At the same time, there was a lot of economic fallout and poverty in the aftermath of the wars, and a lot of distrust of the new state institutions, which meant that a lot of gangs in the Balkans, in Serbia, but to some extent also in Croatia, and a little separately from the Balkan Wars, but Albania's gang was also extremely enriched and got a lot of arms during the Balkan Wars imported into Albania. These gangs began being sort of contractors with heavy weapons, but not lots of money for Ndrangheta and Sinaloa. And so they are many times the ones who either distribute the drugs in different European countries, intimidate other cartels, manage dealers, as in people who use drugs and in exchange deal drugs. They handle a lot of these arrangements for the wealthier partners because that is their comparative advantage relative to them. So this sort of three-way pact between Sinaloa, Ndrangheta, and Albanian Serbian gangs has dominated how cocaine and other drugs got trafficked into Europe. The final thing to mention is the Benelux. So about 60 to 80% of Europe's coke passes through either the Antwerp port or the Rotterdam port. And this has been the case for quite some time. And it is often the first destination after the sea vessels get to Italy. And from there, it gets distributed to the rest of the continent. And the concentration in the Netherlands and Belgium has had two effects. First, just the sheer amount has meant that authorities in these countries are just incapable of monitoring the amount of shipments that come in. They capture, some say 2%, no one says above 10% of shipments of drugs that get into their ports. They're just completely overwhelmed. And the second consequence this had is that a lot of Dutch drug producers and Dutch labs, if you recall, we mentioned before this trend rising in Europe, have been eliminated. And this is a change because the Netherlands used to be a very primary, not just distributor, but also producer of drugs in Europe, especially more synthesized drugs in the times that other gangs around the world didn't know how to make them. So, for example, the Netherlands would make a lot of MDMA. The Netherlands would many times make a lot of refined synthetic stimulants in some more extreme labs and stuff like that. But all of that is getting eliminated because they are still operating at a much higher cost. And the efficiency of the drug trade has meant that a lot of Latin American gangs are able to produce them much more cheaply. So a lot of the Netherlands' own drug producers have vanished. Okay. Oh, right. We have still the Middle East to cover, but I do want us to take a short break before that. So let's be back at like in 4 minutes, 2022. Yeah, so one last thing I want to talk about before we move on to legal drugs and to motion types is the Middle East. So the Middle East plays a very interesting role in the production and distribution of drugs in three main centers. So one is Morocco. So Morocco, many don't know this, fun fact about the country, is the world's by far biggest producer of legal weed. And this is through a product called hashish. Hashish is hemp, but the way that it is made, so just to give a background to those who don't know the fine distinctions of how marijuana works. Marijuana has two components, CBD, which is the thing that has all the medical properties, and THC, which is the psychoactive element that makes you feel high. And THC concentrations are essentially the thing that decides whether this is medical grade, or whether this is or whether it could be used recreationally at a lower THC amount, or whether it is purely in some cases purely recreational, in which the THC content is the highest. Most people, even in countries with illegal weed markets, consume either medical grade or similar THC content grade weed. In some countries, whether legally or illegally, recreational use has weed that has even higher concentrations of THC, and we'll talk about that soon. But in Morocco, since hashish is hemp, but it is slightly higher in THC content, it sits exactly between the normal medical weed and between what is considered in Western countries hemp, which is a low concentration of THC, but still existent. Hashish is exactly in the middle, such that it can often be classified as hemp or often be exported legally to certain European countries, but not always. And in many cases, crackdowns against higher THC contents have destroyed Morocco's hashish industry that before legalization was extremely, extremely successful, because it's much easier to buy hashish legally in Morocco than move it to, for example, ports in Italy that are owned by Casa Nostra or the other one, and then move them across the continent, than it is many times to get routes from Latin America that are more expensive. So the legalization of weed in Europe has, in fact, in many ways hurt and strengthened the Latin American line, because weed that's coming from Morocco has become much harder and much less competitively, profitable relative to legal weed in Europe, or relative to Latin American weed. In terms of Hezbollah and Lebanon, so both Lebanon and Morocco used the legalization of weed quite earlier on than Western countries as a way of getting an economic boost. And in Lebanon's case, this has really important implications because Hezbollah has overtaken most of the weed growing fields that are in the south. And is now exporting them to many Arab countries around, including directly selling to Israel, as well as trafficking to Jordan in order to sell to Israel. And this is a really important route because it dictates how many networks for entrance exist into a specific country, and how much information you're able to get on all sorts of transport networks. So many times Hezbollah would use a lot of information that it got about transport networks in Israel from drug sales in order to coordinate certain attacks. And this also informs security threats in other countries. For example, in Myanmar, some of the reason that China is launching some raids into Myanmar is the fear that the drug trade flowing into China jeopardizes a lot of information about Chinese military movement and about general transport lines around the Myanmar border. So this is another helpful case study for the security implications of drugs. And it's also very important in the case of why Israel is intervening in Lebanon and in Syria. The last thing is Assad's narco state in Syria. And this is the biggest story in the Middle East. So for many decades, the Assad regime, his and his dad, have produced a very unique amphetamine that is unique to Syria, somewhere in effect between Adderall and cocaine, and that was called Captagon. And a Captagon is both more harmful in terms of health, but more importantly, much less regulated. It's much easier to traffic Captagon and put something else in it and stuff like that than other drugs. And so it has created really big problems across Syria. So in countries like Egypt, even Saudi Arabia, there have been very significant health crises associated with the use of Captagon and associated with overdoses due to substances in Captagon that are undisclosed. And this is another example that I think is really useful for IR motions of how drugs are important, because the part of the reason that the Assad regime collapsed so quickly is that 2 days before the fall of Damascus, Assad sent out a call for Arab countries to help him because Iran and Russia were not there. And what happened is that Arab countries rejected his request, and many of them justify a big part of it as being Assad's refusal to clamp down on Captagon production throughout the 2010s, that many of those other countries requested they do. And the reason this is important is because these drug production situations often create tensions between a non-state actor and a country that they're aligned with that neighbors them, because the non-state actor will create a drug problem in that neighboring country. For example, this was a cause for a lot of tension between the Taliban and Afghanistan as well. That's on that. The final thing that I forgot to mention is in terms of other criminal enterprises, one might ask themselves, how do criminal cartels pass all the money that's needed for distribution, for trafficking? Like, how do these big ventures work? Obviously, if you're just paying a dealer to deal to some people, maybe you don't have to. You can Venmo them. But like maybe when it comes to Andrangata, whatever, trading with Mexican cartels, it's a bigger amount of money. And not only that, but in drugs, everything is cash. Almost everything is cash. Like no transactions are made using payment systems that track it for fear of law enforcement. So you usually have massive stashes. Now, what happens is that money laundering is a very important economic process as well as an illegal process. Because what happens is that these cartels just set up businesses whose sole function is to lie and say that their revenue came in from one channel, when in fact it is just the cartel depositing drug money into them. So this is also why casinos and nightclubs are so popular destinations for buying out, for cartels buying them out, because they are both an area where people want to buy drugs, but they're also an area where there is a lot of constant consumer it's very customer intensive and cash intensive, right? You pay for tickets all the time. There are many drinks, so you could lie and say that in a good night you made much more than you did, and funnel it through drug money. So all of these are the sorts of businesses that cartels create. And in countries where cartels are very dominant, this has a real economic impact, because it means that in downturns, cartels can't fund their businesses anymore. And so these money laundering businesses go bankrupt because they're made up. And this can have many implications economically. Cool. Now let's talk about our final section, which is legal drugs. And I'll speed run through this so we have time for questions. So the first thing I want to talk about is the drugs and health benefits that exist in terms of future research into them. So here there are 3 possible ideas that are currently used and might be promising. So the first is that we have not found a better way to kill extreme and chronic forms of pain other than drugs that are also sold illicitly. So opioids are a very effective way to treat pain, chronic pain and terminal illnesses. In fact, some of you might know that Fenta is the name of a drug that is fentanyl that is used medically for cancer. MDMA and shrooms are the hallucinogenic properties, and the trips that you get into have shown to shift certain elements of brain chemistry in a way that could almost act like as if you were taking certain antidepressant medications. And not only that, but they've been many times particularly helpful in people that haven't been aided by any traditional medications and painkillers and antidepressants and SSRIs. So MDMA and shrooms are sometimes thought to be psychiatrically helpful. And finally, cannabis is obviously useful for some parts of pain and nausea relief, and is again especially common in cancers. So that's in terms of the caveats for what is the good use of drugs right now and where we might want to see more research, especially into psychedelics and their psychiatric properties. That is the part of the industry that is least developed, but also some of the effects of cannabis. But there are two very dark sides to legalization and to legal drugs generally. The first is the US opioid epidemic, and generally the chance for overprescription. So as you might know, the US is and was quite dominantly experiencing an opioid epidemic for the past decade and to some extent before. And this was proliferated by a company called Purdue Pharma that produced a anti-pain medication, a pain reliever, that was an opioid called Oxycontin, and they sold it to millions of people who got addicted on it and couldn't get off. Now, what are the tactics that Purdue used for such overprescription? First, they created an epidemic that opioids had to solve. So this was done through, and this is exactly where the nuance comes in about what companies can and what big pharma can do or not. It's not that they falsified research about what opioids can do. It's that they made and paid academics in pain relief, people who genuinely thought they were doing an important job, into publishing papers that explain why the Western world has been neglecting the epidemic of pain for too long, and explaining why we need to take care of the sorts of chronic pains that many people experience. And this sort of narrative made it very easy to appeal to medical communities and to even regulators by saying that even if opioids have some harms, their benefits are really, really immeasurably important. So this is often what big pharma does. They try to use fields that highlight the benefits as reasoning for why you should accept the harms, not necessarily falsifying research that shows the harms. This is also what the tobacco industry did back in the day. But they also prevented a lot of, they also funded a lot of research into the effects of opioids that they knew was conducted poorly. And this is not because the research didn't have peer review or whatever. It's because the problem in researching drugs, and this will be true for other drugs in the future as well, is that when you research their effect, if you administer them in specific contexts, it's often very hard to tell the long-term effects, because Purdue funded research that checked what the opioid, what the effect of pain relievers was on people who didn't have to use them in the long term or chronically. So for example, very acute immediate pain that will get solved through surgery was things that were tested in research studies, but not what happens if you have back injuries that continue lasting and you need to keep staying on some sort of medication. So this is a lot of how they falsified research. The final thing that's very useful to know is that Purdue and big pharma have a unique capacity to capture the FDA when it comes to drugs. And this is because around 2001, the FDA really needed funding. And this is because they had done a lot of experimentation on AIDS drugs because none worked. And in order to fund all of this experimentation, they had to get some more sponsorships than they were getting from the government. And so what happened is that a lot of big pharma funded the FDA up to 50%, such that the FDA had to at some point give them certain concessions on approving their drugs or at least running trials for them, which is what happened with Oxy and with other opioids, that they relaxed a lot of the research requirements on these drugs for this reason. And the last thing that I want you to note is that Purdue settled in 2024. The compensation was given to authorities. It hasn't yet been distributed to victims, and it's not clear if it ever will. And the final thing is that the way the US has addressed it is not by changing. So there's both no legal precedent, but there's also no real policy that's supposed to change the ways that Purdue was able to overprescribe. Instead, the US just made it harder to traffic prescriptions, and they made it harder and they increased funding for addiction plans and rehabilitation. But the central avenue that Purdue exploited has never been fixed. And that is the fact that Purdue would lobby and would offer pain medication to primary care healthcare professionals, which are your GP that you go to, your family doctors. And they did this because they saw that there's a sort of cleavage in healthcare where it is only secondary care specialists that are completely well-versed in the research and that get really great salaries and stuff like that. Primary care doctors that for which you go to for problems like back pain or like knee pain before you go to a specialist, and you don't have to go to a specialist for these problems, have much less of the data and are much more vulnerable to the sort of lobbying and conferencing and giving gifts that Purdue would do relative to the secondary experts. And that's a very, very important gap in healthcare to know about in terms of how overprescription might happen again. Okay. The final part of this presentation is on bad drugs that are still legal. So there are two things here. First, the prescription pipeline. So the drugs that are currently legal and are still bad to some, like if abused, are stimulants like ADHD meds. And the amount of meds that have been dished out for this has been exponentially rising because of the amount of ADHD diagnoses exponentially rising. The second thing is that there are obviously still some opioids around, but that are prescribed more conservatively. So things like morphine and codeine. The one thing that is at a danger of being overprescribed and is also rising in popularity are benzodiazepines. These are depressants that are also produced in order to suppress and get some effects that are similar to opioids. They are less harmful in the short run, but have a lot of long-term risks as well. And these are being handed out quite abundantly. These are things like what's the V medication? If someone knows what medication I'm talking about, shout it out. Maybe I'll remember. Anyway, the last thing I wanted to say is that cartels are very much adapting to whatever drugs are sold legally. So, for example, the response to the Oxy crackdown, as I said before, was to push more heroin or fent or push more meth. The ADHD drug boom has meant that many cartels are producing and buying many more stimulant. It's not Viagra, but thanks. The cartels are selling a lot of things that are branded as Adderall. And finally, the benzo abuse, the legal drugs, has meant that that many cartels are counterfeiting Xanaxes in order to meet benzo demand. Finally, weed. So weed, as I said before, has changed completely ever since legalization in terms of the international market. This is because legalization has pushed up big cannabis producers in Canada and in the US. And this has also meant that Mexican cartels, which we talked about, have eliminated the part of their business that handles weed and shifted to worse drugs as a result, which is part of the criticism against legalization of weed. But there are a few other problems that you should know that are specific to the legalization of weed. First is that there is very much a race to the bottom among big THC. Like the California THC content is very it's Vicodin, by the way. Yes. So sorry, the V medication. Maybe it is helpful to solve ADHD. So the California THC content has meant that many illegal cartels and gangs are still trafficking weed, but it's originally legal weed that comes from California, but they're trafficking it into other areas because of how high its THC content is. And this is also the reason that some illegal gangs are still operating, because the discrepancy between the legal amounts of THC and illegal amounts of THC is so high that it's still worth it for consumers. The other thing is that the high THC content is an extremely exponential harm on users, in the sense that very high THC content, more than California, that is currently being sold in some illegal markets, has been labeled as harmful to the same extent as meth and heroin. And this is really bad because legal weed is making people more resistant to weed, which means that the chance that they get this illegal weed rises as well with legalization. The final thing to notice is that big cannabis is not that different from big pharma. As in, yes, they have much less money right now, but you should consider how many of the current narratives about weed's helpfulness and a lot of the loopholes we talked about when it comes to big pharma can also be used by big cannabis to overprescribe or make cannabis too accessible. And the final thing is also that in the Netherlands, Belgium, and UK, all of those small amateur dealers and labs we talked about have also had to switch to worst labs. So even the sort of dealer that you would get your drugs from, your weed 10 years ago, might now tell you, I'm out of weed, I can't sell anymore. I only have MDMA or ketamine or liquid benzos, which are like a soft drink. And this is also very bad because it means that many dealers that people opt into by perceiving them as only dealing soft drugs have had to shift to hard drugs, but their customers don't know that their standards have shifted. So they keep trusting their dealer when they give them something that's supposed to replace what they lost. Cool. That is it for the substantive part of the workshop. Sorry that it was a little long. I'm gonna do the following. I'm gonna now ask if anyone has any questions. And if people don't have that many questions, or if no one wants to ask questions, and if there's interest in it, I'm willing to stay and talk about how drugs play into some motion examples that I have here, but we don't have to do this given how long it's already been. So if anyone has any questions, now's the time.
So I just wanted to go back to the question I asked before about the US and China.
Yeah, so as we said with the context of the Sinaloa cartel, China is a very big producer of the chemical precursors that you need in order to produce fentanyl. And many organized crime organizations, but also just some somewhat legitimate firms, have been selling all those chemical precursors to the US and to cartels in Mexico. Now, the question about whether this is a deliberate strategic policy, I don't know. I do know that policing around this hasn't been extreme, and that the theory for this is because China wants fent coming into the US. But I don't know to tell you beyond this. Does anyone else have any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I've always been interested to know, like, how do you think legislation affects norms around how people think about drugs on the ground?
Yeah. So is your question whether I think legalization of drugs makes it much more likely that people consume them, or whether illegalization makes it likely that people avoid them?
Yes, like how does any state involvement with drugs have an impact on how we think about them, interact with them, use them, in society in general?
Yeah, so that is a good question. I think this is a little more in the topic of state interventions or law enforcement into drugs, which maybe we'll talk about in a different workshop. But I guess the main thing I would say that is not, I guess, immediately trivial to anyone thinking about this question is that the extent to which the illegality of drugs changes whether you're willing to consume them doesn't matter, it seems, as much as you would expect in drugs that are already widely consumed. So in things like if during probation, or even in countries where weed is illegal, or countries where vapes are illegal, all these things have not really affected the amount of people that genuinely consume them, or the extent to which they affected them is still under an increase of 50%, right? So for example, in Canada, people have been consuming drugs. The increase in weed consumption since legalization has been something like 7%, which is less than half of the population that consumed weed before legalization. But I think it changes two things that are worthwhile to know about. One is the intensity with which you consume drugs. So many drugs that are not completely addictive, like weed, for example, are drugs that you would avoid consuming a lot if they are illegal. But if they are legal, you face much less social and legal repercussions from consuming them. So you increase the intensity a lot, which is also why in many legalized countries, even if the amount of people that consume cannabis doesn't increase that much, the amount of people that get health complications related to it does exponentially rise. And the second thing is that this is not true about hard drugs. Like I think there are some countries where hard drugs are essentially legalized. Not very few, but for example, the like some Middle Eastern countries have a very lax approach to very hard drugs. And towards those drugs, I do think it changes significantly because they're not normalized enough for people to not know that there's a risk. And I think that most people interpret the very long jail sentences as too big of a risk to ever try it. That's my thoughts.
Thank you. Can I just ask, will the slides be available?
Sure. I'm happy to post the slides with the recording. I am very happy with the I'm very proud of the slides, so I definitely want to share this artistic creation. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay. In that case, I think we should wrap up because it has been almost 2 hours, but anyone who wants to, I guess, talk through drug-related motions, feel free to text me.